It's with the greatest pleasure that I'm introducing Associate Professor Nancy Cushing. And there were so many things that I wanted to tell you about her that I had to jot them down so I didn't forget. Nancy's done a great amount of research on Newcastle and Central Coast regions. She's also jointly edited A History of Eric Worrell's Reptile Park and one of the books that we have on our shelves in the library on Radical Newcastle. She was an editor of that as well. She's written on the surf lifesaving movement. She's written about pollution. Her book's aptly named Smoky City. She's also written about diet and on live exports, on animal culling and many other interesting and relevant topics. So in fact, Nancy has over 84 publications according to the university website, probably even more than that now, and has brought grants to the university of over $260,000. She's on the executive board of the New South Wales History Council and the Australian New Zealand Environmental History Network. She's also the founder of the Global Newcastle Research Group. But tonight it's in her capacity as an environmental historian, which includes human-animal relations, that she shares with us her research on the Australian warhorse.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, Mel, to speak to everyone tonight. And thanks to those of you who've come along. It's really lovely to see 3 of my PhD graduates here in the audience tonight. That's it really is a pleasure that we've been able to keep in touch and stay friends after being supervisors and supervisees. I'm so impressed with the work that you do here as a family history society, especially the recent forays into podcasts, which I've been listening to when I'm on my cross trainer doing my exercise of an evening. So it's really nice to stay in touch with everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the ongoing relationship of the Awabakal people to this place and pay my respects to elders past and present and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us this evening or perhaps listening in or listening later on. So as you've heard, I'm an environmental historian at the University of Newcastle. I'm currently the Coral Thomas Fellow at the State Library of New South Wales, where I'm working on a project on animals in Sydney. And at the same time, somehow, I'm writing a book called A New History of Australia in 15 Animals. And this sort of sketches out what I'm trying to do with that book. In trying to pick the 15 animals, that was the hard thing, first of all. And I wanted to make sure that I represented different types of animals, different scales of animals, some that were extinct, some endangered, some that were thriving, ones that were differently positioned, so pests and native animals and introduced species, feral, free living, domesticated, to cross the continent in the scope of those animals and to have different time frames from deep time to the present. So this is what I ended up with. These are my 15 animals in sort of roughly chronological order in the way that I'll be treating them in the book. And you can see that I've highlighted the horse as one of those animals. And so today's topic has been matched with the day's big event in Melbourne, but it in no way endorses that event or the whole racing industry. I feel a bit uncomfortable with it all, but I'm bringing out themes that will be relevant to horse racing as much as they are to the use of horses in war. And so I want to start with this image just to clarify my relationship with horses, which is rather distant, I have to say, almost exclusively through the written word, images, and artifacts. It's not through flesh and blood horses. And I expect there are people here present that have had very close relationships with horses through their lives, much more personal ones than I do. And in the discussion, I'd be really happy to have your thoughts on anything that I say. And, you know, if you need to pull me up on something that I don't have quite right, I'm happy for that. I'm always happy to learn. I gave a version of this talk in Singleton back in, I think it was February, and I certainly heard a lot about people who knew way more than I did about horses. After the talk, the chairs went in a circle, and I was sort of spoken to after that. It was really wonderful. So, and the other thing is that I'm thinking and writing about animals, and I'm trying to center them in my work. So I'm not trying to speak on their behalf because I don't think that's really possible, but I do what I can to shift the perspective of them when they're usually just the backdrop or a tool to achieve something that humans want to have happened. And so I try to shift them to being subjects at the center of their own lives. And I particularly try to gain a sense of how they experience the worlds they inhabit and how they exercised agency. So how they were able to take actions that shaped what are now called more than human histories. So that means histories that acknowledge that humans are just one set of actors who affect and are affected by other living and non-living things that make up our shared world. So it's all about decentering the human and giving other animals a chance, a go to be recognized in history. And so for today, and in my chapter, my focus is on the Australian horses of the First World War, but that's not where the history of Australian horses at war begins. The horse is a first fleeter, of course, introduced by the British from South Africa as they began their hostile occupation of Australia. So horses were part of the original invasion, but like convicts, they were unwilling immigrants. They were forced onto ships for voyages of 4 to 6 months, with restricted water and dry fodder, buffeted by high winds and rough seas, overheated during the calms. Many died along the way from stress, poor feed, disease, and injury. For the horses who survived the journey, living in Australia meant a return to familiar types of work, carrying riders, pulling carriages, wagons, and later trams, operating winding gears here in Newcastle in the coal mines, and powering agricultural equipment on farms, pulling plows, helping to move flocks and herds of other animals, and providing entertainment in the form of racing. Horses didn't do this willingly. In an article in yesterday's conversation, Catherine Henshaw, who's a postdoctoral fellow in veterinary science at Charles Sturt University, wrote about the telos of the horse. That is, its anatomical, physiological, behavioral, and cognitive characteristics. And so she summarized the main points about horses as being that they live in groups. They form long-lived social relationships. They eat by grazing on fibrous plants and are in, when they get to call the shots, they're on the move for up to 18 hours a day. They solve challenges as they move through their environments. They learn, they play, and they have the capacity to move away when they sense danger. That's an important thing for a horse that is essentially a prey animal. So training a horse to work is to a large extent making it accept a life in which this telos is not honored. And we have lots of material evidence of what it takes to dehorse a horse. It took a wider range of gear, including bridles, blinkers, bits, breastbands, saddles, stirrups, straps, collars, halters, harnesses, whips, hobbles, fences, stalls, and barn doors to control and direct their movement. And I think this is a beautiful portrait of a horse from St. Heliers up near Muswellbrook, about 1835. And we don't see any of that apparatus of control. This looks like a horse that's in command of its own destiny. But when it's going to be ridden, when it's in closer association with people, all of those bits of equipment come into play. So even so, the horses who lived in the bush did maintain some autonomy. In accounts of rural life in the 19th century, a very common element is the time spent looking for horses who had strayed when turned out to graze outside of their work assignments. I was struck when I was reading some firsthand accounts of the colonial period, how many times adventures, discoveries, and mishaps begin with the words, "When I was out searching for my horses, ... indicating how thinking like a horse, having to go out and think, well, where would that horse be? I need to think like a horse. I need to go to water. I need to go to, an open area where there's grass. Opened humans to new encounters with the world, and how being without a horse limited opportunities. So they weren't just going to continue their day without the horse. They needed the horse or they couldn't get on with their day. It was worth tracking down these horses, not only because of the energy they could supply for work tasks, but because of their qualities of speed and strength and beauty and size were so impressive that they enhanced the status of humans associated with them, like the horse in the previous slide. So people from bushrangers through to city businessmen and the ladies of high society all prided themselves on having well-groomed horses, handsome horses, matched pairs of horses. These reflected well on them. This pride in horses means that they are the non-human animal that has had perhaps the greatest number of paintings and photographs made of them, which becomes a wonderful resource for an animal historian like myself. If you're looking for the horse here, what's that? Yeah, just over here in the dusk, you can see the horses have been hobbled, so chains around their legs so that they can't actually stride or run away, but they can move around a little bit. And sometimes quite a bit, and then you're looking for the horse again in the morning. Another role demanded of horses in Australia was that they assist in conflicts between humans. This began within Australia in the displacement of Aboriginal people. When they first encountered horses, most Aboriginal people were intimidated by what would have been the largest land animal that they had ever seen. Taking one documented example, when Governor Macquarie arrived at the Grand Depot, which was the early name for Bathurst, after his first crossing of the Blue Mountains on the newly opened Cox's Road in 1815, the few Wiradjuri men and boys who were there were more frightened by the horses, who they knew as Yarraman, than by the rest of the vice-regal equipage. Many of these first meetings were with horses carrying intruders on their exploratory missions. Exploring parties were quasi-military in character, many with an official status, a named leader, firearms, and horses for riding and carrying supplies. While you may have learned at school that explorers mapped empty lands, where a horse could go was usually an environment that had been altered by human activity, whether it was kept free of underbrush by systematic burning, or whether they were moving along tracks that had been established by human feet. Horses helped to open access to Aboriginal country, making it available for the sheep and cattle, which would compete with the humans and other locals for food and water. And of course, Aboriginal people did not allow this to happen without resistance. The qualities of horses contributed to giving the colonists the upper hand. Researching the wars between the Wiradjuri people and settlers on the Bathurst Plains of central New South Wales from 1822, Stephen Gapps found that securing grazing land for sheep and cattle was a prime reason for expansion, and that horses were central to this conflict. Bathurst Commandant James Morissette, you might know as a local commandant here too, said that horses were essential to this operation. He was writing back to Sydney and saying, "I need horses, send me horses. Horses are essential." The horses gave settlers greater mobility and speed than humans reliant on their own lesser capacities, and a higher vantage point from which to survey a landscape and to shoot down on those on the ground. Horses enabled the tracking down of Aboriginal people and rapid escape when Aboriginal people would otherwise have themselves had an advantage. And all of this, of course, made horses a target. So they didn't really have an interest in these conflicts, but they became targets for Aboriginal people. Gapps records the Wiradjuri leader Blucher's warriors attacking a small party of armed and mounted settlers. Their spears and boomerangs struck the horses, while the men, the settlers on their backs, were uninjured. And of course, this spread across the continent. The colonization of South Australia began in the 1830s. We hear about those who arrived by sea, but less about the settler colonists who poured overland along the Murray-Darling route. Writing about this period, Robert Foster and Amanda Nettlebeck described an almost continuous train of sheep, cattle, bullock drays, and horses extending from Sydney to Adelaide. Much of the violence against Aboriginal people along this route was from the hybrid of a man on a horse with a gun, giving the invaders an advantage on the rapidity of movement and their range of sight across the landscape. Ordinary settlers were joined by mounted police and by the army. The commander of the 96th Regiment was directed to secure horses from local settlers so his forces could patrol the Port Lincoln area in 1842. So horses are very much part of this ongoing frontier war in Australia. And in addition to this regular but small-scale killing of Aboriginal people by colonists, there were larger-scale massacres. The colonial massacre map developed by Professor Lyndall Bryan and her team at the University of Newcastle plots these, and in the description, it includes a field labeled transport. So you can see down here where there is a known form of transport that was used, they include it. And I haven't found out whether you can search all of these fields, but it would be really interesting to map and to graph how many times horses were involved in these massacres. So this one is with regard to the killing of at least 18 Wanneroo people in September 1826 in retaliation for the murder of 2 convicts on the Bridgeman estate at Fall Brook near Singleton. It was aided by horses, as at least 5 mounted policemen took part with 8 others, led by Magistrate Robert Scott. Horses were central to the war waged on Aboriginal people, which ran throughout the 19th century. So those are the first examples of Australian horses at war, and I'll now move on to foreign wars. Australian horses were also shipped overseas for use by British troops in other colonies. As horses adapted to Australian conditions, they gained a reputation for hardiness, sure-footedness, stamina, and a calm demeanor. These qualities, paired with their relative cheapness, made horses from Australia attractive for military use overseas. In India, they were given the generic name whalers, indicating they came from New South Wales. To distinguish them from horses from Britain, South Africa, or elsewhere, horses were being imported from lots of places into India, because horses didn't live very long then. But the term whalers was used for all Australian horses, no matter which colony they came from. The voyages they undertook to get to India were arduous, beginning by being hoisted onto ships and ending with precarious arrangements like this for landing them in small boats. In India, whalers were not considered to be prestigious horses for parades or for commanders, but were well suited for use in combat, as well as being readily repulsed. They could always ship in more. Their short lives led to an ongoing demand, with some 330,000 being dispatched to India between the 1860s and the 1930s. When Australian colonists volunteered for overseas service, horses were conscripted to join them. And so I use those terms advisedly. We were always so proud that we were armies of volunteers, but the horses didn't volunteer. They were just told they were going. Mounted military forces, often short-lived, had been formed in the various colonies since 1840, taking the names of volunteer cavalry, mounted rifles, yeomanry cavalry, light cavalry, mounted volunteers, and light dragoons. So all of those implied that horses were involved as well. These soldiers traveled to New Zealand in the 1860s and stood ready to act in the Crimean War in 1854. When they joined the Sudan conflict in 1885, for the first time it was with horses sent from Australia. And both horses and troops from the Australian colonies fought in South Africa from 1899 to 1902. That's what this image is from. As the first horses and troops departed from Sydney in October 1899, each horse in its own shipboard stall was described as being a sleek, clean-limbed whaler with a mild, clear eye, a pretty head, and a velvety, strokeable nose. It's unlikely that all of the 16,000 horses sent were quite so perfect. We see this horse is looking maybe a little bit worse for wear after having served in South Africa. Although Australians were described as good horsemen during this conflict, they were not good at looking after their horses, 67% of whom died of disease, injury, and maltreatment. Fearing the diseases they might bring back with them, none of the survivors was permitted to return to Australia. Based on this experience of Australian men and horses being able to make a useful contribution to imperial war efforts, when Australia's defence forces were being organised after Federation in 1902, it was decided that they would include a field force that could be sent to any threatened area, whether that was within Australia or overseas, and that 2/3 of it would be made up of mounted troops. So there was a real conjunction between Australians and war service and being mounted troops. And so now at last we'll arrive at the war that I promised you, the First World War. From the perspective of the Australian horse, this was the largest single war they participated in. More than 130,000 Australian horses served. Despite having provided horses for the British military for almost a century, when Australia's 2.5 million horses were surveyed in 1913, it had been estimated that only about 6% met Army standards. I think Australians have a overinflated sense of how good their horses are or were, but when they were being surveyed very objectively for military purposes, a very low percentage actually met the standards that were required at that time. Roughly this proportion was then purchased during the war by travelling horse buying boards on behalf of the Australian Army Remount Department, with the largest number coming from New South Wales. By May of 1917, 43,000 draft and riding horses had been supplied for the AIF, almost all of them purchased for about £20 a head, and very small numbers given as gifts, being chargers owned by officers or already having belonged to the army. In terms of the quality of the horses, part of the problem, according to the British Army Remount officer who wrote a report on all of this in 1922, it was that horses had too much autonomy in Australia. He said that the usual way that horses were raised was that several mares were placed in large paddocks with a stallion, breeding was left to their own decision-making, and all humans did was appropriate their offspring in an annual muster. In his view, this was poor practice, leading to injuries, losses, breeding by unfits, and many horses that were useless for military purposes. So he had one aim in mind, and it wasn't autonomy of horses. Still, Australian horses did have a good reputation in the First World War, likely due to careful selection processes, as I say, only 6% approximately being selected. And as historian of the light horse Jean Bou argues, excellent horse management regimes. So that's what Australians were really good at, was looking after the horse they had. The continued strong performance by Australian horses after 1960, by the horses used by Australians after 1916, when horses were no longer being sent from Australia, supports this idea that it wasn't the horses, it was the care of the horses that was important. So in thinking about how to treat Australian horses in the First World War, and referring back to my earlier comment about how often images are made of horses, I decided to be guided by the images that appeared in the 12th volume of C.E.W. Bean's Official History of Australia in the War of 1914 to 18. I was really hoping you might have a copy of it here so I could just wave it around, but if you ever get a chance, it's in most large libraries, like at the university and in the city. It's a great volume to look through and see all these photographs of the First World War. It has 750 photographs in this volume. It's quite thick. It shows Australians at home, on ships, overseas in New Guinea, Pacific Islands, Caribbean, Egypt, Turkey, on the Western Front, in Great Britain, in the Middle East, Russia, and India. And so I set myself the task of sitting in the State Library, going page after page, looking for non-human animals in the photos that were included in this book. And so can you see the cat here, tucked in a nice sealskin vest, a crew member of the HMAS Australia in the North Sea in 1916. There's a dog on the steps at the base at Diran with General Chauvel and his desert mounted corps. There are mules visible in aerial photographs of an Indian ambulance mule camp at Gallipoli, and the donkey who worked with John Simpson Kirkpatrick to carry the injured at Anzac Beach. There were some carrier pigeons, but they were hidden in rectangular boxes. You couldn't actually see pigeons in the Jordan Valley, and lots of camels. lots of camels. But predictably, it is the horse who features most in these photographs. Horses service began in the training camps in Australia. And so you can see this one, and can you read the caption? Men of the original light horse of the AIF before departure. But the men, on my estimation, take up about, what, a sixth of the photo? That's a picture of horses, if I've ever seen one. But the horses aren't even mentioned in the caption. They're not named. They're not really considered important. The horses were part of embarkation parades in Hobart, and their photo made it into the official volume. And 12,000 of them traveled on the first convoy of 48 Australian and New Zealand troop ships that departed from Albany in Western Australia in November 1914. After a voyage of some 2 months via the Suez Canal to the Mina camp outside Cairo, the horses were allowed to recover from the voyage slowly in this very different environment. And so this is how horses were put on and off ships. Yeah, pretty traumatic for horses. This was the way that lots of stock was loaded in Newcastle Harbour too. Some of my other work was on the sheep and cattle that were shipped to New Caledonia from Newcastle, and there were complaints in the Newcastle Herald about the way that they were being moved on board. So moved in a sling onto the ships, arriving at the Mina camp outside Cairo. So the horses were allowed to recover slowly in this very different environment, starting with fresh food and water and gentle walks and working up to short rides before being introduced to the idea of functioning as a unit in a brigade. Bean included an image that captured the dryness of this campsite with horses and the pyramids barely visible through a canson or dust storm. So this is a more clear image. This one is credit to Jude Conway. This is her uncle and his great uncle and his horse in Egypt. And so we do see that. And I think the family story is that he took his horse with him. And that I haven't been able to track down. I haven't been able to confirm or deny. But that is a very common story that people took their own horses. So I do need, anyone could help me, to get some authoritative accounts of that. So while the horses acclimatized, the light horse men were being trained in how to look after them well, with properly adjusted saddlery and regular opportunities for rest. Another 18,000 horses made the journey to Egypt prior to 1916, when a lack of shipping capacity brought their arrivals to a halt. The remainder of the horses who left Australia during the war, outnumbering those who went to the Middle East, were sent to India. So that 330,000 that I mentioned before, that was included in that went to India over a 70-year period, includes the World War I period. So as you would be aware, the first major campaign of the war for Australians was at Gelibolu Yaramadasi, in English better known as the Gallipoli Peninsula, almost due north through the Mediterranean from the Mena camp. Reflecting the limited knowledge of what Anzac troops would face there, 6,000 horses were shipped to be part of the invasion force. Imagine trying to get horses up those cliffs that the men could hardly even get up. In a stroke of luck with the horses, it was realized they would not be of assistance in the hilly terrain, and they were returned to Egypt. So that was a near miss for their horses. The light horsemen who served there served on foot, and it was mules under the direction of Indian troops and donkeys who lived there, who were pressed into providing transport services horses undertook elsewhere. And so there's John Simpson Kirkpatrick with a donkey. After the withdrawal of the troops back to Egypt, some of the Australians, both human and 11,000 equine, were deployed to Northern Europe in 1916. There they encountered all manner of new and frightening things. In the villages of northern France, many Australian horses had their first exposure to walking on cobblestones and the presence of tramps. Much worse was to come, of course. Photos show them pulling wheeled vehicles laden with artillery, supplies, and water on the Western Front, where they also drew ambulances and carried the wounded to dressing stations. Horses slogged their way through the mud and snow of the Somme. These conditions made their tasks of moving people and equipment difficult, often sinking up to their stomachs and clinging mud so thick it had to be scraped off them. Putting into place an idea suggested by an Australian warrant officer, in some instances, wheeled vehicles were exchanged for heavy wooden sledges that enabled the wounded and equipment to be drawn over the surface of the mud, although the horse's hooves still sunk into it. Just a warning on this next slide, it does show dead horses. So the official history includes many photographs containing dead soldiers, but the first dead horses only appear halfway through the book, with 3 bloated carcasses seen along the Menin Road after the Third Battle of Ypres. They stand in for the thousands of horses killed or wounded by shells and bombs dropped from airplanes, requiring a continuous flow of remounts. The Australian Veterinary Corps, started in 1909, did its best to look after sick and injured horses that could be saved, as well as training others in veterinary first aid and animal care. Just as shell shock amongst humans was increasingly recognized during this war, during the Battle of the Somme, the mobile veterinary section noted that horses suffered from shock and overstrain. For those with physical injuries, there was an Australian veterinary hospital in Calais. And so this horse, as it says, it's showing the pit used for foot cases. So it's particularly got something wrong with its foot. But it has been etherized so that it won't struggle. These horses in France and Belgium were often overlooked, while the 10,000 deployed with the 2 Australian mounted divisions in the Middle East have been more celebrated. Horses proliferate in the Middle Eastern section of the photographic record, being shown at leisure, on the march, on parade, although rarely in action. The most celebrated action of Australia's Middle Eastern campaign was the Battle of Beersheba, also known as Beersheba in Australia, near Gaza in Palestine on the 31st of October 1917. Attacks by the Anzac and Australian mounted divisions, led by General Chauvel, were conducted for a whole day, but it's the mounted charge by the 4th and 12th Light Horse, a mounted infantry division that would usually have dismounted to fight late in the day that has captured attention. And so this is a reenactment of the Beersheba charge for the official cinematographer, Frank Hurley. So you were mentioning Frank Hurley and his staged, don't know what these are. This looks like, are they angels or flies on the lens of the camera?
Fake bombs.
I'm not sure what they are. But this is the aftermath of what it was really like there at Beersheba. So this was even then considered rather old-fashioned, a charge on horseback, a low-tech strategy that appealed to those who still thought of war as a romantic adventure, and it's been portrayed in several films. That it was successful, opening the way for the capture of Gaza and opening the way for the southern Palestine offensive, and credited by some with turning the momentum against the Turks, added to the appeal. It is striking now reading accounts of these battles while hearing media reports of the current Israeli attacks on the Palestinians as a reminder of how riddled with conflict this region has been for so long. The defeat of the Turks in the First World War led to Britain gaining administrative control over the region as a League of Nations mandate in 1922, and then to the partitioning when the State of Israel was established in 1948. So we can draw a line from what's happening here to what's happening there. Success in the Middle East would not have been possible without horses in good condition. Care for horses is manifested in details large and small in these photographs. Looking closely here, we can see that the horse is wearing a sort of fringe or braid on its forehead. These were called brow bands, and this was a local design intended to keep flies away from the eyes. And if you look closely, you can see them on a lot of the horses in these images. The limits of horses affected how Australians were able to fight. On their own, horses, as I mentioned before, are trickle feeders. They graze on grass for up to 10 hours a day. When fed by humans, they can acquire similar nutrition and bulk more quickly from combinations like hay, oats, chaff, bran, and vegetables. But they have small stomachs and constant flow of gastric juices. So that means that food needs to come in regular bursts, not all at once, and that's enough for a whole day. And if they don't have anything in their stomachs, those gastric juices cause ulcers that are very painful and can be fatal for horses. They also need ample water. For a saddle horse, the weight of daily food required is on average about 25 pounds a day, or 11.3 kilograms. And for larger, heavier horses, they need more than that. Supply lines for fodder were essential to maintaining horses, and what the Minister for Defense, George Pierce, on a visit to the Middle East in 1916, called the most horrible type of country on earth. And he praised the horses even above the men for their service there, for having such wonderful powers of endurance. And I think this is not something horses want to be praised for, because it means that things are really bad for horses. At Magdaba in December 1916, the 9th Light Horse Regiment attacked Turkish forces on foot because their horses had to be returned early to El Arish because of a lack of water. And the attack of Beersheba was only able to go ahead because of the presence of wells nearby. And so here we can see how they were accessing water, putting in spear point pipes into the sand and then pumping water up to the surface. It was often brackish, not really ideal for horses. And here we have the horses in under as much shade as could be found for them, and fodder bags here. So they have, this was how they were carrying the food for the horses around. And you notice that they're keeping the horses away from them. So they have to limit the amount of access to the food that they have. From the point of view of the horses, this experience must have been close to a living death, as they were pushed to and beyond their limits. Long-honored norms in horse care, such as watering them at least twice a day, were set aside by authorities when it suited them. So if we look at the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade, they stated that it was an exploded idea that horses needed 2 drinks of water each day. With training, they claimed horses could go for 30 hours without harm. In 1917, Major General Sir Harry Chauvel praised the splendid quality of horses supplied to him in the Middle East from Australia. He recounted how they had to make do with brackish water, short rations, heavy weights, long hours, walking on soft sand, and noted instances when they had done so without water for 30, 36, even 52 hours. He admitted that some had died from exhaustion, and more became so ill that they had to be evacuated and nursed back to health. So while troops might have taken on such conditions out of patriotism or personal values, and an understanding that success could shorten the period during which they had to serve, horses had no conception of why they were made to live in this way. One of the most revealing photos about the importance of horses is this one, that doesn't even contain any horses at all. Instead, it shows a herd of dummy horses, padded, 4-legged wooden structures covered with blankets, thousands of which were set up in the Jordan Valley in 1918 as a decoy from the actual location of troops and forces north of Jaffa. To aid the deception, mules were attached to sledges and driven around the dummies to raise dust, to suggest activity and obscure the view of them. So, the end of the war, thank goodness. By the end of the war, in November 1918, some 136,000 Australian horses, some estimates add another 20,000 to this number, had joined the war effort, working with artillery, infantry, and light horse brigades of the Australian Imperial Force and for the British and Indian governments. About 2/3 of those sent to Europe and the Middle East had been killed in action or died of injuries, disease, or overwork. But in 1919, the army faced the challenge of what to do with the remaining horses and mules. Despite the service provided by the horses, they were viewed as war materiel rather than personnel. And while human veterans were returned home, horses were not. Issues cited were the cost. The cost had been acceptable on the outward journey, but not for the return. A lack of shipping capacity, true, cause for delays, perhaps, but not for not bringing them back at all. and quarantine restrictions. And so remember what's going on at the end of the war. Quarantine, Spanish flu raging, quarantine is topical. And most returning troops themselves had to spend a period of time in quarantine. But racehorses and other livestock were still being admitted to Australia. And they did go through quarantine, and then they were released into the general population. So it was clearly a choice not to repatriate the horses who had made such a contribution to the war effort. Instead, the policy was to sell them at auction, and that's what we can see happening here in a town street in Belgium. In Europe, those who had survived the war in reasonable condition were shipped to Britain to be sold, and others were auctioned locally in Belgium and France. Australian soldiers were banned from buying them, as were former enemies. Officers who asked to buy their horses were reminded that they would not be permitted to land them in Australia. So they could buy them, but they wouldn't be able to take them home. Those in too poor a state to continue to labor went to horse butchers. In this way, the horses who had already given so much made their final contribution, boosting the post-war meat supply. There were also 9,800 horses in the Middle East. For 2/3, their service continued as they were sold to the British for £35 a head. Remember, they were purchased for £20 a head a couple of years earlier, for use by the imperial occupying force. Those deemed too old or unfit were euthanized. There's no evidence to support the belief that servicemen shot their horses rather than leave them behind. I think that's one of the other lasting tropes or myths about this. Indeed, having read large numbers of letters and diaries, life force historian Jean Beau suggests that stories of close bonds between horses and servicemen are infused with post-war romanticism. More typically, light horsemen did not mention their horses at all in their writing, or only recorded a very utilitarian view, which was the general view of horses at the time. That is, that as at war, as at home, in cities and rural areas, horses were working animals and no more. They completed valuable work, but they were also the source of unrelenting labor for their carers, feeding, watering, grooming, and picketing. Leaving them behind was in some ways liberating, according to both. Now, I want to return to that odd horse's head that I showed you at the beginning of this talk. That was Sandy, a bay gelding with a star on his forehead. Sandy had worked for a brick-making company in Tallangatta, Victoria, and was donated to the Commonwealth government not long after the declaration of war. In Egypt, Sandy became the favorite horse of AIF Commander Major General Sir William Bridges. And he did make the journey to Gallipoli with Bridges and was just as quickly returned safely to Egypt. So this ensured that Sandy escaped the fate of Bridges, who was shot by a Turkish sniper at Gallipoli and died of his wounds in May 1915 while being evacuated for medical treatment. Bridges was initially buried in Alexandria, but within a few months it was decided his remains should be returned to Australia, the only person to have this honor until an unknown soldier was exhumed and returned in 1993. When Bridges' body arrived in Australia, ceremonies were held in both Melbourne and Canberra, and he was buried at the Royal Military College at Duntroon, which he had founded, with his grave marked in 1920 with a memorial designed by Walter Hurley Griffin. When they had the procession in Melbourne, there was a horse in that procession that was said to be Sandy, said to be Bridges' faithful horse, but it wasn't, because even with this powerful patron, Sandy had just returned to the ranks of being an ordinary war horse. He was sent to France in March of 1916, and he remained there for almost 2 more years of active duty, including being gassed and suffering damage to his eyesight. But he and his association with Bridges were not forgotten in Australia, and a movement began to have Sandy, like Bridges, returned to Australia to live out his life at Duntroon. Skirting the quarantine problem, Sandy was held at the remount depot at Swidling in the UK for 3 months and certified as free from disease. He survived a 2-month return voyage to Melbourne on the ship called the Boral under the supervision of a personal groom, and he arrived in November 1918, just as the armistice was being signed. Rather than going to Duntroon, he was kept at Maribyrnong Central Remount Depot in Melbourne, where he remained until his decline led to him being euthanized in 1923. At the time of his death, Sandy was eulogized as representative of the horses that were not permitted to return. So I quote, he was one of a heroic band which worked for humanity, patiently, silently, faithfully, and then laid down toil-wrecked bodies for the same cause. Far from the land of their birth, they worked, and far from that land they died, all of them, all save one. Sandy. So this high regard was not expressed in the usual way with a dignified burial, but with Sandy's death being managed by a team from the Australian Museum, which put him down and then cut off his head. Although usually a sign of enmity or wrongdoing, in this case, it was intended as a compliment. In contrast with the 1930 Melbourne Cup winner, managed to get the Melbourne Cup in, Farlap, whose whole body was preserved after his death 9 years later, Sandy's poor condition and the costs involved limited his taxidermy to just his head and neck. He was not allowed to look like a horse, but is forever enclosed in a bridle used by Bridges before leaving Australia, so not one that he'd ever worn in his lifetime. The head was mounted and placed on display first in Sydney and then at the Australian War Museum in Melbourne and finally in the Australian War Memorial. Sandy's hooves were separately polished and mounted, one each being presented to Duntroon, where it was put on display in the officers' mess, thanks for cringing, to the Minister of Defence, and two went to senior public servants. A couple more memorials have followed, one unveiled in 2017 at the Remount Depot, which followed 15 years of lobbying by the Friends of Sandy, and another last May near Sandy's original home of Old Tallangatta. If you're interested in reading more about Sandy, there's a play about him called As Told by the Boys Who Fed Me Apples by R. Johns, published by the Currency Press in 2017, which is actually rather nice and quite moving. So I hope this talk has given you a sense of what I'm trying to do in my book. I'm not a horse, and I can't write from the perspective of one. I'm not trying to do what some authors have called ventriloquizing an animal, purporting to somehow channel their inner views. I can, however, draw together scientific understandings and historical evidence to try to bring out how the past was experienced by non-human animals, and to draw attention to how their capacities and needs have shared more than human histories. I put up this image from the bulletin because it's this hybrid of human and camel. And you know, I think that too often we struggle to think of animals without anthropomorphizing them. And I try not to do that as well. And so I'll just leave with this beautiful image. So in terms of the horse in war, the qualities of horses were co-opted by settler colonial Australians to assist with conflicts at home and overseas. The needs of horses set limits on what was possible, although humans did all they could to try to extend and exceed them. For horses, war meant a sequence of events that exposed them to a wide range of risks, and for the majority led to a premature death. And so that's on that unhappy note, that's where I will leave it. But with this lovely image of how horses might do things differently if they have their.
And it was good to hear that not all the horses were just shot. I think that's come from a movie, hasn't it, about some horse. There's a Dunkirk that the horses were shot from a movie. Because someone has told about this talk, was maybe going to watch it on Zoom, but they were a bit worried that it'd be too sad.
Yeah, that's really sad.
Well,
but yes, but it's interesting.
Because she thought that in the end they were all shot.
Yes, well, no, that's certainly not true.
I mean,
because they were still viewed as an asset. You know, they were, as I said, war materiel. They were, you know, like the wagons or anything else that you still wanted to get some return on your investment, and just to shoot them, that's a dead loss, really. I mean, you know, they were eating some of it for horse meat, so they were going to get something back from them, even though they'd already given so much, and they should have all just been turned out to pasture and allowed to graze on daisies for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
Yeah, the idea that an individual soldier would be able to just shoot their horse because they didn't want it to go into their hands. I mean, I guess what we hear is to the Egyptians in particular, that they, or the people of the Middle East, that they were so abusive to animals that they preferred that they die rather than be left to that sort of life. That, you know, that would have been an offense against military order to do that. They would have been in big trouble if they'd taken it upon themselves to do something.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. What an eye-opener. Yes. You presented some really amazing facts there to get us thinking. Yes. And I think a few people are writing down some information there so that they can go and do a bit of extra research. I know I'll be doing a bit of that. Thank you again for coming along and sharing your knowledge with us. We're always so grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.